The best weapon almost never wins. Picture the gun in your hands in any war film you've seen. Slower to load than a bow, worse at aiming than a sword. Jamming, misfiring, choking in the rain. For its first 200 years, the gun was worse than what it replaced. A trained archer could loose 10 arrows before a musketeer fired once. And still, the sword died. The bow died, both perfected over 1,000 years, wiped out by a clumsy metal tube that barely worked. So here's the question nobody asks. Why does a worse weapon beat a better one? Somewhere in a Chinese monastery, an alchemist grinds 3 powders together, chasing a formula for a drug that would let a man live forever. He is looking for immortality. What he finds is the opposite. Mix charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter in the right measure, and you get a powder that burns faster than fire can travel. The recipe for the deadliest thing humans had ever made was hiding inside a search for eternal life. And here is the first clue to our question. The thing that killed the sword was never meant to be a weapon. Everyone assumes the gun won because it hit harder, reached farther, killed more surely than steel. That's the story we inherited, but the earliest guns did none of that well. They were slower, blinder, more likely to maim the man holding them than the man in front. So the answer can't be power. It can't be range or accuracy, because the sword and the bow beat the early gun on every one. The gun didn't win because it was better. It won because of something no sword could offer, something with nothing to do with how deadly it was in one pair of hands. To see it, you have to start where the change cut deepest. Start with the man who had the most to lose. Picture a knight in full plate armor, standing in a field at dawn. Every piece of him is covered in shaped steel, hammered and fitted to his body by a master smith over months of patient work. That armor cost more than a farmer could earn in a lifetime of harvests. It could turn a sword stroke into a harmless scratch. It could stop an arrow dead at 100 paces. For 300 years, a man dressed like this was the most dangerous thing on any battlefield in the world. He was a walking fortress, and he knew it. Now put a peasant across the field from him, dirty, untitled, barely fed. He is holding a crude iron tube packed with the alchemist's powder and a single ball of lead. He has never held a sword in his life. He couldn't afford one buckle of the knight's armor. He trained for this weapon in a matter of weeks, maybe less. His hands are shaking. He barely knows how to aim. And when he pulls the trigger, the lead ball punches straight through that beautiful steel like it was wet cloth. The knight drops, the fortress falls. All that craftsmanship, all those months of forging, undone in the time it takes to blink. It falls to a man who couldn't have laid a finger on him in any fair fight for 1,000 years before that morning. One shot, one cheap ball of lead. That was all it took. Now think about what that lead ball really destroyed. Not one man, a whole class of them. For centuries, the armored warrior sat at the very top of the social order precisely because he was so hard to kill. Kings needed him. Peasants feared him. His near invincibility was the reason he ruled, the reason he ate first and died last. And the physics behind it is brutally simple. A sword or an arrow delivers its force along an edge or a narrow point, and good steel is shaped to deflect exactly that, to send the blow skidding off to the side. But a lead ball arrives with so much raw energy packed behind it that the steel has no answer. It doesn't deflect the blow, it caves straight inward. Think of it like the difference between pushing on a door and driving a truck through it. The very thing that made the knight untouchable, that gorgeous, ruinously expensive shell, turned into dead weight in a single generation. Men who had trained since they were boys to rule the field woke up one morning to find their whole reason for existing had been cancelled. Cancelled by a tube of metal a village blacksmith could hammer out in an afternoon. You can almost feel it, the ground shifting under an entire way of life. And the strangest part is what all of this did to the men who used to be untouchable. But that's not the wild part. The wild part is what the gun did to a skill that took a lifetime to build. Picture an English longbowman, not on a battlefield yet, but as a boy of 7, being handed his first bow. He will spend the next 10 years of his life pulling that string. Every day, his father pulls one, his grandfather pulled one. In some towns, the law demands it. Every man practicing at the archery butts on Sunday because a country's whole defense rested on these men. And here is what a decade of that does to a human body. It rewrites the skeleton itself. Archaeologists who raised the wreck of a sunken warship pulled up the bones of these archers from the seabed, and they could pick them out instantly, without a second look. The spine twisted to one side, the left arm thickened like a tree limb. The finger bones and the shoulder deformed and overgrown from a lifetime of drawing a weight most modern adults couldn't pull even once. Let that sink in. The weapon didn't just train these men, it reshaped them from the inside, bent their frames around itself, marked them for life. This wasn't a job, it was written into their bones. A longbowman wasn't made in a season. He was grown, like an oak, over half a lifetime, and a kingdom could only ever have so many of them. Now hand that crude iron gun to a man who has never fought a day in his life. How long before he's dangerous? Not 10 years, not 10 months, a few weeks, maybe less. Point it, brace it, pull the trigger. The powder does the work that a decade of torn muscle and warped bone used to do. Think about what that actually means. The longbow was arguably the better weapon well into the age of guns. Faster, more accurate in skilled hands, deadlier at a distance. But you couldn't mass-produce the hands. That was the trap, and it was a trap nothing could break for centuries. Every longbowman was a 10-year investment walking around on the battlefield, and when he fell, 10 years fell with him, gone in an instant, impossible to replace before the next season's fighting. The gun broke that math completely. It moved the skill out of the man and into the machine. The weapon got harder to make. The soldier got almost disposable. Cheap, replaceable, expendable in a way a longbowman never was. And once a king realized he could turn any peasant into a killer in a month, the fate of the longbow was sealed, no matter how good it still was. The skill didn't matter anymore. That trade-off is still baked into every weapon since. And it opens a door onto something stranger, because if the gun really was the worst weapon on paper, then something is very wrong with how we tell this story. But here's the part that stopped researchers cold. Line the two weapons up, side by side, and score them the way an engineer would, one column at a time. Rate of fire. The longbow wins, and it isn't close. A trained archer looses 10, maybe 12 arrows in a minute, a steady rain of them. The early musketeer manages one, if his hands are steady and the powder stays dry and nothing jams. Accuracy. The bow wins again, easily. An arrow flies true to where the eye sends it. An early smoothbore musket ball wanders off target past 50 paces, a coin toss whether it hits the man you aimed at or the one standing beside him. Range. In skilled hands. The bow. Reliability. Not even a contest. The bow works in the rain, in the cold, in the mud. The musket chokes, misfires, floods in a downpour, and sometimes blows apart in your own face. Cost of the weapon itself. The gun is harder and more expensive to make. So line up the scorecard and look at it. So here is the paradox, laid completely bare. On nearly every single measure a soldier would actually care about with his life on the line, the gun was the inferior weapon. Slower, blinder, more fragile, and it won anyway. Completely, totally. It didn't just edge out the bow and the sword by a hair, it erased them from the earth. Now sit with how strange that is. We tell ourselves that progress means better tools beating worse ones, the sharper blade, the stronger engine, the faster machine winning, because it is simply superior. That's the whole story of technology as we understand it, the story we were all taught. But right here, at one of the most important turning points in the entire history of violence, the worst tool won, and it wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't a single lucky battle. It happened across Europe, across Asia, across the Middle East and North Africa. Everywhere the powder spread, the same impossible thing unfolded, the perfected weapon quietly giving way to the clumsy one, over and over, generation after generation, as if some hidden force were pushing the whole world in a direction that made no sense at all on the battlefield itself. Historians who study this shift have puzzled over it for a long time, because the numbers on paper point one way and history went the other. And that contradiction is the real mystery. Because the truth is, the contest was never really settled on the battlefield at all. The gun wasn't competing on rate of fire or accuracy. It was competing on something the bow and the sword could never touch. Not in 1,000 years. And by that one measure it didn't just win, it wasn't even in the same league. To understand what that measure was, you have to stop thinking like a soldier aiming a weapon and start thinking like the man who had to raise an entire army from nothing. Because he was doing a very different kind of math, a colder kind. And what he figured out would decide which weapon your descendants carried for the next 500 years. Take a breath here, because you've just watched a lot fall apart. The knight's armor, the archer's 10 years, The whole idea that the better weapon wins. So let it settle for a moment. But while it settles, look at one thing that refuses to fit the story you've just been told. If the gun really swept the board this completely, if it made the sword useless as a killing tool, then the sword should have vanished. Melted down, forgotten, gone the way of the stone axe. And yet it didn't. Here is the strange part. For 400 years after the gun made it obsolete on the battlefield, men kept wearing swords. Kings wore them. Generals wore them into battles decided entirely by cannon and rifle. Officers hung them at their hips in wars where a blade was about as useful as a walking stick. The thing that lost had somehow earned the right to stay. Why would people cling, for centuries, to a weapon that could no longer do the one job a weapon exists to do? That question opens a second door, and behind it is something the scorecard could never measure. Because it turns out a weapon isn't only a tool for killing. It's also a symbol, a piece of who you are, and that is a fight the gun was never really built to win. Hold on to that. We'll come back for it. But here's what nobody talks about. Picture an officer in the 19th century, dressing for battle. He buttons a uniform that will face rifles and cannon. And then, out of habit older than the gun itself, he reaches for his sword and buckles it to his hip. He knows it won't decide anything. He knows the men who kill and die today will do it from 200 yards away, behind clouds of smoke, long before any blade could ever be drawn, and he wears it anyway. Everyone around him wears it anyway. Why? Because by now the sword had stopped being a tool and become something much harder to name. It had become a piece of who a man was. For most of recorded history, only certain people were even allowed to carry a blade. A sword marked you as noble, as trained, as someone with the right to take a life and the honor to answer for it afterward. Peasants got clubs and knives and pitchforks. Gentlemen got steel. There were laws about it. In places, real laws, deciding who could and couldn't wear one. The weapon on your hip announced your rank and your bloodline before you ever opened your mouth. Carrying a sword said, "I am someone," and that meaning didn't die when the killing power did. It outlived it by centuries. So the sword slipped quietly sideways, out of the soldier's hands and into the language of ceremony. Think about where you still find one today. An officer's dress sword worn at a military graduation, gleaming and untouched. The flat of a blade a monarch touches to a kneeling knight's shoulder. The sabers crossed in a bright arch above a newlywed couple walking down the aisle. The ceremonial guard standing rigid outside a palace, hand resting on a hilt that has never drawn blood. None of these swords will ever cut anything. They aren't meant to. They were never meant to. They carry a completely different kind of weight now. The weight of honor, of tradition, of history, of belonging to something far older and larger than yourself. A gun could never do that. Nobody hangs a musket over a wedding aisle. And here's the quiet irony sitting underneath all of it. The gun took over the killing so completely, so totally, so absolutely, that it quietly freed the sword to become something it never could have been while lives depended on it. Pure meaning. Stripped of its bloody job, the blade turned into a symbol, and a symbol, it turns out, can be almost impossible to kill. But even that isn't the deepest reason the sword lost the battlefield. Because underneath the honor and the ceremony, there was a cold, simple calculation happening. One that decided everything, and it had nothing to do with courage at all. And this is the part that changes how you see everything. Here's what all of this has really been about. The thing hiding under every battle we've talked about. Stop thinking about the weapon. Start thinking about the man who has to build an army. Put yourself in his boots. You are a king, or a warlord, or a general, and a rival is marching on you. You have one season, maybe two, to field a force that can stop him. So you sit down and do the only math that matters. Option 1, the longbow. To field 1,000 longbowmen, you needed to start about 10 years ago. You needed 1,000 boys, each handed a bow at 7, each drilled every single week until their bones bent to the shape of the weapon. You can't buy that. You can't rush it. You can't conjure a master archer in a crisis, no matter how much gold you have, because the one thing his skill required was time, and time is the one thing a war never gives you. Option 2, the gun. Take 1,000 farmers, ordinary men pulled off their fields last month, men who have never held a weapon. Hand each one a musket. Show them how to load it, level it, and fire. It takes an afternoon to teach the basics. 3 weeks later, you have 1,000 soldiers who can drop an armored knight from across a field. And here is the cruelest part of the math. If 100 of them fall tomorrow, You don't lose anything you can't replace. You simply hand 100 more muskets to 100 more farmers, and by next week the hole is filled. Try doing that with longbowmen. You can't. The dead archer took 10 years of training into the grave with him. Now stand in that ruler's boots and tell me which weapon you choose. It was never really a fair fight, because the two weapons weren't even answering the same question. The bow asked, "How good is your best soldier?" The gun asked, "How fast can you make 1,000 more?" And a kingdom that can replace its army in a month will always, eventually, grind down a kingdom that needs a decade to raise one. That's the answer. That's the whole answer. The gun didn't win because it was deadlier. It won because it turned killing into something you could mass produce. And this is where the whole story finally turns over. The real victor was never the musket at all. It was the math, the cold arithmetic of scale, of how many, how fast, how cheap, how replaceable. And that same cold arithmetic is exactly why the sword survived. Remember the question we left hanging. Why would anyone keep a weapon that lost? Here is the answer. The sword was never in that equation at all, because it stopped competing on scale the very moment the gun arrived. It quietly retreated to the one place numbers could never follow, into meaning, into honor, into who we are and where we come from. The gun won the math, the sword kept the soul, they stopped fighting over the same ground entirely, and that is the single reason, the only reason, both of them are still with us today. So here is the thing to carry out of all this. Your world doesn't run on the best tool. It runs on the tool that anyone can pick up. And look back at everything we walked through, and you'll see it was never really 5 different stories. It was one. The knight in his priceless armor, undone by a ball of lead a blacksmith could pour in an afternoon. The longbowman, 10 years in the making, replaced by a farmer who trained for 3 weeks. The scorecard where the gun lost on speed, on aim, on reliability, and won anyway. The sword that couldn't cut a thing at a wedding but refused to disappear. And underneath every one of them, the same quiet force doing the same cold sum. Not which weapon is finest, but which one can I make 1,000 of, this month, with the men I already have. That is the logic that swept the sword off the battlefield, and it never once switched off. It is still running today, everywhere, in every factory that chooses the design it can build by the million over the one a single master could perfect, in every army that trains recruits in weeks instead of decades. The same sum running quietly under all of it. The gun didn't beat the sword because it was better. Nothing about this was ever about better. It won because it asked a different question, the only question a world at war ever really cares about. How many and how fast? And the sword, the beautiful, useless, undefeated sword, survived by refusing to answer that question at all. It walked off the battlefield and into the one place mass production could never reach, into meaning. That is why, even now, you can still hold both of them in your mind at once. The clumsy weapon that conquered the whole world, and the beautiful one it could never quite kill. Somewhere right now there's a sword hanging on a wall, maybe in a museum case, maybe over a fireplace, maybe at a soldier's side in a photograph from a graduation. It hasn't drawn blood in generations. It never will again, and a few feet away, in a display, or a holster, or a headline, sits the thing that made it obsolete. A weapon that was clumsier, slower, and uglier in every way that once mattered. The worse weapon won the world, the better one won something the world couldn't take away. We didn't stop using swords because we found something deadlier. We stopped because we found something anyone could carry. And we kept the sword anyway, hung on the wall, because some part of us always knew that a weapon was never only about how many people it could kill. It was about who we imagined ourselves to be while holding it.